The morning sun cast long shadows across Bayfield Municipal Airport as Jake Morrison walked toward the weathered hangar that housed his pride and shame. The rusty corrugated metal building sat apart from the newer facilities, like an embarrassing relative at a family gathering. Inside waited his 1987 Bell UH-1H Huey, a Vietnam-era relic that had seen better decades. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The helicopter's olive drab paint had faded to a sickly green, with patches of primer showing through where salt air had eaten away at the original finish. The rotor blades bore scars from countless hours of service, and the engine cowling was held together with more rivets than the manufacturer had originally installed. To most people at the small coastal airport in Louisiana, Jake's Huey was an eyesore, a mechanical dinosaur that belonged in a museum rather than active service. But Jake saw something different when he looked at that battered aircraft. He saw reliability forged in the crucible of combat, simplicity that meant fewer things could go wrong when lives depended on it, and a payload capacity that modern civilian helicopters couldn't match. The old bird had carried soldiers through the jungles of Southeast Asia, hauled supplies to oil rigs in the Gulf of Mexico, and performed more emergency medical evacuations than Jake could count. Still, that didn't stop the snickering from the pilots of newer aircraft whenever he fired up the ancient turbine engine. The distinctive whop-whop of the Huey's rotor system announced his presence like a mechanical dinosaur roaring to life, drawing smirks and head shakes from the sleek corporate helicopter crews who shared the airfield. "There goes Morrison in his flying museum piece," they would mutter, watching him lumber into the sky with all the grace of a loaded freight train. Their modern machines were whisper-quiet, climate-controlled, and equipped with glass cockpits. That looked like something from a science fiction movie. Jake's Huey had analog gauges, worn leather seats, and an intercom system that crackled with static from decades of use. But Jake had learned long ago that appearances could be deceiving, especially when it came to aircraft. He had started flying helicopters in the Army 25 years earlier, training on the very same model that now drew mockery from his civilian colleagues. After his military service, he had worked for offshore oil companies, flying crews to drilling platforms in weather that grounded more sophisticated aircraft. The Huey's robust construction and proven reliability had saved his life more times than he cared to remember. When budget cuts forced his downsizing from the oil company, Jake had purchased his old Huey from military surplus and started Morrison Helicopter Services. The business was modest, consisting mostly of cargo runs to remote locations, aerial surveys for construction companies, and the occasional emergency medical transport when the hospital's newer helicopters were unavailable. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills and kept him in the air. The other pilots at Bayfield Municipal thought Jake was clinging to the past, unwilling to admit that his era had ended. They flew sleek machines with turboshaft engines that purred like contented cats, while Jake's turbine whined and clattered like an angry mechanical beast. Their helicopters had sophisticated avionics systems that could navigate through fog and storm clouds with precision, while Jake relied on compass headings and visual references that had served pilots for generations. What they didn't understand was that Jake's apparent technological disadvantage was actually his greatest strength. While they had grown dependent on computerized systems and automated flight controls, Jake had maintained the fundamental piloting skills that separated true aviators from button pushers. He could fly his Huey by feel, reading the machine's moods through vibrations in the controls, and changes in engine tone that told him everything he needed to know about its condition. The morning of September 15th started like any other, with Jake performing his routine pre-flight inspection in the humid Louisiana air. Hurricane Delilah had been tracked for days as it churned across the Gulf of Mexico, growing stronger with each satellite update. The National Weather Service had issued evacuation orders for the barrier islands and low-lying coastal areas, but many residents had chosen to ride out the storm in their homes. Jake had seen enough hurricanes to know that meteorologists' predictions were educated guesses at best. Storms could intensify rapidly, change direction without warning, or weaken just before landfall. What remained constant was the human tendency to underestimate nature's power and overestimate their own ability to survive its fury. As he checked the oil levels and inspected the rotor blades for damage, Jake's radio crackled with increasingly urgent weather updates. Delilah had strengthened to a Category 4 hurricane during the night, with sustained winds approaching 150 miles per hour. The storm's projected path had shifted slightly eastward, putting the small fishing community of Pelican Bay directly in its crosshairs. Pelican Bay was home to about 200 people, mostly shrimpers and their families who lived in modest homes built on stilts to survive the periodic flooding that came with life on the Louisiana coast. The community was accessible only by a single causeway that crossed 5 miles of marsh and open water. When storms threatened, that causeway became a lifeline for evacuation, but it also became impassable when winds exceeded tropical storm force. By noon, the first outer bands of Hurricane Delilah were already pushing waves across the causeway, making vehicle travel treacherous. Emergency management officials had closed the road and were urging any remaining residents to seek shelter in the community's designated storm shelter, a concrete block building that served as the local school during normal times. Jake monitored the emergency radio frequencies as he secured his hangar against the approaching storm. Other helicopter operators had already moved their aircraft inland or battened them down with tie-downs and protective covers. The smart money was on getting as far from the coast as possible and waiting for the hurricane to pass. But Jake had learned something during his years of flying emergency missions. The time when it seemed most dangerous to fly was often the time when flying was most necessary. Storms didn't follow convenient schedules, and people in distress couldn't wait for perfect weather conditions. Around 2 p.m., the first distress call came through on the Coast Guard emergency frequency. A fishing boat had broken free from its moorings in Pelican Bay and was being driven toward the rocky breakwater by increasing winds. The 3-man crew was trapped aboard as waves began washing over the vessel's stern. The Coast Guard's nearest helicopter was grounded by weather conditions at their base 40 miles inland. Their high-performance aircraft were equipped with sophisticated flight control systems that became unreliable in severe turbulence, and regulations prohibited flight operations in winds exceeding 50 knots. Jake listened to the radio traffic with growing concern. The fishing boat crew had maybe an hour before their vessel was either swamped by waves or driven onto the rocks. Coast Guard rescue boats couldn't reach them in the deteriorating sea conditions, and other nearby vessels had already sought shelter. Without really thinking about the consequences, Jake began his pre-flight preparations. The Huey's simple mechanical systems didn't care about turbulence or crosswinds. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The helicopter had been designed to operate in combat conditions where enemy fire and severe weather were just additional challenges to overcome. As he started the engine and performed his run-up checks, Jake's radio crackled with a transmission from the airport manager. "Morrison, this is Bayfield Tower. Are you seriously planning to fly in these conditions?" "Roger, Bayfield. I'm responding to a maritime emergency in Pelican Bay. 3 souls in distress. Jake, the wind is gusting to 60 knots out there. Your insurance doesn't cover storm operations, and I can't authorize takeoff under these conditions." Jake paused for a moment, considering the implications. If something went wrong during the rescue attempt, he would be personally liable for any damage or injury. His modest business couldn't survive a major lawsuit, and his pilot's license could be suspended for reckless operation. But somewhere out in the increasing fury of Hurricane Delilah, 3 men were fighting for their lives while their boat was slowly being destroyed by waves and wind. The math was simple in Jake's mind. Certain financial ruin was a small price to pay for the possibility of saving lives. Bayfield Tower, I'm departing under emergency authority. If anyone asks, I'll take full responsibility for this flight. The takeoff was unlike anything Jake had experienced in 25 years of helicopter operations. Wind gusts hit the Huey from multiple directions, trying to push it sideways across the runway or slam it back down onto the tarmac. The old helicopter fought like a living thing, its rotor system bending and flexing under loads that would have exceeded the design limits of more modern aircraft. But the Huey's robust construction and proven engineering held together under punishment that would have grounded sleeker machines. Jake climbed slowly into the storm, fighting for every foot of altitude as wind shear tried to knock him out of the sky. The flight to Pelican Bay normally took 15 minutes in calm conditions. Fighting through the outer bands of Hurricane Delilah, it took nearly 40 minutes of the most demanding flying Jake had ever experienced. Rain hammered the windscreen so hard that visibility was measured in yards rather than miles, and turbulence tossed the helicopter around like a toy in the hands of an angry child. When Jake finally reached Pelican Bay, the scene below was like something from an apocalyptic movie. The small fishing community was already partially submerged, with water rushing through the streets and around the stilted homes. The causeway had disappeared completely beneath storm surge that was still rising as the hurricane's center approached. But the immediate crisis was the fishing boat that was being battered against the breakwater rocks. The vessel, a 30-foot shrimp trawler named Miss Catherine, was taking on water through a hull breach caused by repeated impacts with the jagged limestone. Her 3-man crew had climbed onto the boat's cabin roof, but waves were already washing over their position with each surge. Jake circled the scene once, assessing the wind patterns and looking for the safest approach. The breakwater created a small lee area where the wind was slightly less violent, but getting close enough to perform a rescue would require flying within feet of the rocks while fighting crosswinds that could slam his helicopter into the same obstacles that were destroying the fishing boat. The Huey's rescue hoist had been removed years earlier as an economy measure, so Jake would have to improvise a way to get the fishermen off their sinking vessel. He carried 100 feet of marine rope in his cargo compartment, standard equipment for helicopter operations over water, but using it effectively in these conditions would require precision flying that pushed his skills to their absolute limits. Jake keyed his radio to contact the fishing boat directly. Miss Catherine, this is helicopter November 7 to 4 Lima. Can you hear me on channel 16? Static filled the airwaves for several seconds before a desperate voice crackled through the interference. Helicopter, this is Captain Rodriguez on Miss Catherine. We can see you up there. Our boat is taking on water fast, and we can't hold on much longer. Copy that, Captain. I'm going to try to get a line down to you, but I need you to listen carefully to my instructions. Do you have anything aboard that you can use to secure a rope? We've got dock lines and a few carabiners. Whatever you're planning, you better do it quick. This boat is going under in the next few minutes. Jake positioned the Huey as close as he dared to the fishing boat, fighting constant wind gusts that tried to push him into the breakwater rocks. The helicopter's main rotor was only 20 feet from the stone barrier, close enough that he could see individual barnacles on the rocks through his side window. He threw the rope out his cargo door, but the wind immediately caught it and blew it away from the sinking vessel. 3 more attempts yielded the same result, with the hurricane-force winds making it impossible to accurately place the line where the fishermen could reach it. Time was running out. The Miss Catherine was settling lower in the water with each wave, and the crew was having difficulty maintaining their grip on the slippery cabin roof. Jake realized that conventional rescue techniques weren't going to work in these extreme conditions. That's when he remembered a maneuver he had practiced during his military training but had never used in civilian operations. It was dangerous, under the best circumstances and potentially suicidal in hurricane conditions, but it might be the only way to save the 3 men below. Jake brought the Huey into a hover directly over the fishing boat, matching its movement as waves pushed it back and forth against the rocks. The helicopter's skids were less than 10 feet above the vessel's cabin, close enough that the rotor wash was creating a small bubble of calmer air around the rescue site. "Captain Rodriguez, I'm going to try something that's probably crazy, but it's our only option. I'm coming down to about 6 feet above your cabin. When I give the word, I need all 3 of you to grab onto my landing skids and hold on no matter what happens. Are you out of your mind? In these winds, we'll all be killed. Maybe, but you're definitely going to die if you stay on that boat. It's going under in the next minute or 2. Jake began his descent, using every bit of skill he had acquired in 25 years of flying. The Huey's rotor blades were spinning just above the Miss Catherine's radio antenna, and one wrong move would either decapitate the fisherman or destroy his helicopter. But the old aircraft responded to his controls with the reliability that had made it legendary among military pilots. "Now, grab the skids." All 3 fishermen lunged upward simultaneously, their hands finding purchase on the Huey's metal landing gear. The sudden addition of 600 pounds of human weight threw off the helicopter's balance, and Jake had to make immediate control adjustments to prevent a crash into the rocks. With the 3 men clinging to his landing skids like human cargo, Jake began one of the most challenging flights of his career. The hurricane winds that had made the rescue so difficult now became even more dangerous with the aerodynamics of his aircraft completely altered by the external human load. The flight back to Pelican Bay's school building took 10 minutes that felt like hours. Every gust of wind threatened to tear the fishermen loose or slam the overloaded helicopter into the ground. Jake flew at barely 20 feet above the flooded streets, weaving between power lines and around buildings while his 3 passengers held on with strength born of desperation. When he finally reached the school, Jake found that the building's parking lot was under 3 feet of water, making a normal landing impossible. But the school's roof was flat and appeared sturdy enough to support the Huey's weight. Jake brought the helicopter into a hover over the building and gently lowered the fisherman onto the roof before setting down himself. The 3 men from the Miss Catherine were hypothermic and exhausted, but alive. As they stumbled toward the school's roof access door, Captain Rodriguez turned back to Jake with tears streaming down his face. "You saved our lives, man. I don't know how to thank you. Just get inside and get warm. This storm isn't over yet." But Jake's rescue mission was just beginning. As the fisherman disappeared into the school building, his radio erupted with new emergency calls. Hurricane Delilah was intensifying as it approached the coast, and Pelican Bay was about to experience the full fury of a major hurricane making landfall. The storm surge was rising faster than anyone had predicted, and water was already flowing into the first floor of homes that had been built to withstand normal flooding. Families who had planned to ride out the hurricane in their elevated houses were finding themselves trapped as water reached levels that threatened the electrical systems and structural integrity of their homes. "This is Pelican Bay Emergency Coordinator to any aircraft in the area. We have multiple families requesting immediate evacuation. The storm surge is exceeding all predictions, and we have people trapped in second-story rooms with no way to reach safety." Jake looked around at the scene unfolding below his position on the school roof. The small community was rapidly becoming an archipelago of rooftops and upper floors, surrounded by churning brown water. People were appearing on balconies and roofs, waving frantically at his helicopter. The smart thing to do would be to fly back to Bayfield Municipal Airport and wait for the storm to pass. He had already risked his life and his aircraft to save 3 fishermen, which was more than anyone could reasonably expect from a civilian pilot operating a surplus military helicopter. But Jake had seen enough natural disasters to know that the next few hours would determine who lived and who died in Pelican Bay. The Coast Guard helicopters were still grounded by weather conditions at their inland base. Emergency management. Officials were overwhelmed by the scope of the crisis, and the National Guard wouldn't be able to deploy rescue aircraft until after the hurricane passed. The only aircraft capable of operating in the current conditions was his aging Huey, and Jake was the only pilot foolish or brave enough to fly it in the heart of a major hurricane. He made the decision that would define the rest of his life. Pelican Bay emergency. This is helicopter November 7 to 4 Lima. I'm available for evacuation operations. How many people need immediate rescue? Helicopter November 7 to 4 Lima. We show approximately 50 residents still in the flood zone. Most are in two-story homes or on rooftops. We're prioritizing families with small children and elderly residents who can't swim. 50 people. Jake did the math quickly in his head. The Huey could carry maybe 8 passengers per trip under normal conditions, but hurricane winds and the need to hover near unstable structures would reduce that number significantly. He was looking at least 10 flights through some of the most dangerous weather conditions imaginable. The rational part of his mind screamed that it was impossible, that he would be killed long before he could rescue even half the trapped residents. But the part of him that had become a helicopter pilot in the first place, the part that had chosen a career where machines defied gravity and human skill could make the difference between life and death, refused to abandon 50 people to the storm. Jake lifted off from the school roof and began the most important mission of his aviation career. His first stop was a 2-story house where a family of 5 was trapped on the upper floor. The parents had 2 small children and an infant, and the father was frantically waving a white towel from their bedroom window. The house was surrounded by water that was still rising, and wind-driven debris was flowing past like a river of destruction. Jake brought the Huey into a hover next to the 2nd-story window, fighting wind gusts that threatened to slam his rotor blades into the house's roof line. Getting the family into the helicopter required them to climb through the window and step onto the Huey's cargo floor while Jake maintained a precise hover in hurricane-force winds. The father handed his infant to his wife, then helped his 2 young children make the terrifying transition from their bedroom to the aircraft's cabin. As the family secured themselves in the passenger seats, Jake climbed back into the storm and headed for the school evacuation center. The short flight gave him time to assess the deteriorating conditions and plan his next rescue. The wind was getting stronger as Hurricane Delilah's center approached, and debris was becoming an increasing hazard as the storm surge ripped apart docks, boats, and anything else that wasn't permanently anchored. After depositing the family at the school, Jake returned to the flood zone for his second rescue. This time, his target was an elderly couple who lived in a mobile home that had been lifted off its foundation by the rising water. The trailer was floating like a boat, held in place only by utility lines that could snap at any moment. The couple, both in their 70s, had managed to get onto their roof through a small access hatch, but they were too frail to lower themselves into the helicopter's cabin without assistance, and Jake couldn't leave his controls to help them physically. That's when he remembered the marine rope that had proven useless during the fishing boat rescue. Jake threw one end down to the elderly man and shouted instructions over the rotor noise. "Tie that around your wife's waist, that around your own. I'm going to pull you both up together." It was another maneuver that violated every safety regulation Jake had ever learned, but conventional rescue techniques couldn't cope with the extraordinary circumstances of a major hurricane. The elderly couple trusted him completely, securing the rope as instructed and allowing themselves to be hoisted into the helicopter's cabin like sacks of grain. As Jake flew them to safety, he realized that each rescue was taking longer than the previous one. The deteriorating weather conditions were making every aspect of the operation more difficult, from finding the trapped residents to hovering accurately near their locations. Fuel consumption was also higher than normal due to the constant power demands of fighting hurricane-force winds. But there were still dozens of people trapped in the flood zone, and Jake was the only rescue asset available. He pushed aside thoughts of fatigue and mechanical stress, focusing entirely on the immediate challenge of reaching the next family before their situation became hopeless. His third rescue involved 6 members of an extended family who had gathered in one house for a hurricane party that had turned into a nightmare. The storm surge had flooded their first floor, trapping them upstairs with no way to escape. Jake managed to load all 6 passengers in a single trip, filling the Huey's cabin beyond its rated capacity, but staying within the performance limits that he knew from experience. By the time he completed his 4th rescue, Hurricane Delilah's eye wall was approaching Pelican Bay. The wind speed had increased to the point where Jake could feel the Huey's airframe flexing under loads that would have exceeded the design specifications of more modern helicopters. But the old aircraft continued to perform, its robust construction and proven reliability holding together under punishment that its original designers had never imagined. The 5th rescue presented Jake with his most challenging scenario yet. A single mother with 3 young children was trapped on the roof of her house, but the structure was already beginning to collapse under the combined assault of wind and floodwater. Jake could see that the roof might not support his helicopters. Wait if he attempted to land on it. Instead, he had to hover next to the disintegrating house while the mother passed her children to him one at a time. Each transfer required her to lean across a gap of several feet while holding a terrified child, trusting that Jake could maintain his position precisely enough to prevent them from falling into the churning water below. The last child, a boy, who couldn't have been more than 5 years old, froze with fear when he saw the gap between the roof and the helicopter. His mother pleaded with him to move, but the child was paralyzed by terror. Jake could see that the house's roof was sagging dangerously, and structural collapse seemed imminent. Without thinking about the consequences, Jake set the helicopter down on the weakened roof, accepting the risk that the additional weight might cause the entire structure to collapse. The gamble worked long enough for the mother to carry her son directly into the aircraft's cabin, but Jake could feel the roof giving way beneath his landing skids as he lifted off. The house collapsed completely less than 30 seconds after the Huey departed, its remains disappearing beneath the storm surge that continued rising toward levels that no one in Pelican Bay had ever seen. Jake's 6th rescue took him to a nursing home where 12 elderly residents had been moved to the 2nd floor as the 1st floor flooded. The building's administrator had called for help on a handheld radio, reporting that several residents were having medical emergencies and required immediate evacuation. The nursing home's 2nd floor had a large balcony that could accommodate the Huey's landing, but getting 12 elderly and infirm patients into the helicopter would require multiple trips. Jake managed to evacuate 4 residents on his first trip, including a woman who was having difficulty breathing and needed immediate medical attention. As he returned for the remaining nursing home residents, Jake realized that Hurricane Delilah's eye was approaching Pelican Bay. The wind was beginning to shift direction as the storm's center passed overhead, creating even more turbulent conditions. That made precision flying increasingly difficult. But the changing wind patterns also revealed something that made Jake's blood run cold. The storm surge had risen far higher than anyone had predicted, and water was beginning to reach the 2nd floors of buildings throughout Pelican Bay. The nursing home residents, who were still waiting for evacuation, were in immediate danger of drowning. Jake pushed his helicopter and his own endurance to their limits, making 3 more trips to the nursing home in conditions that should have grounded any sane pilot. By the time he evacuated the last elderly resident, water was lapping at the building's second-floor windows. His radio crackled with reports of more families in distress. A couple with a disabled child was trapped on their roof as their house began to break apart in the storm surge. 3 teenagers who had ignored evacuation orders were stranded on the second floor of a beach house that was being undermined by waves. An elderly man with a heart condition was alone in his flooding home, too weak to reach higher ground. Each rescue required Jake to push his aircraft's capabilities further beyond its normal operating limits. The Huey's engine was running hotter than normal due to the constant high-power demands of fighting hurricane winds. The transmission was vibrating in ways that suggested internal stress from the repeated heavy lifting operations. And Jake himself was approaching the limits of physical and mental endurance that define human performance under extreme conditions. But he continued flying because the alternative was unthinkable. Every person he left behind was someone who would almost certainly die when the storm surge reached its peak. The responsibility felt crushing, but it also provided the motivation he needed to keep going when every rational instinct told him to seek shelter. As Jake completed his 10th rescue flight, he realized that Hurricane Delilah's eye was directly overhead. The winds had suddenly calmed to an eerie stillness, and brief glimpses of blue sky appeared through the thinning clouds. But Jake knew from experience that the eye's passage would be followed by the storm's most violent winds as the backside of the hurricane arrived with renewed fury. He had maybe 30 minutes of relatively calm conditions to complete the remaining rescues before weather would make further flight operations impossible, even for his rugged Huey. Jake pushed his helicopter to maximum speed, racing against time and the approaching eye wall to reach the families who were still trapped in the flood zone. The temporary calm allowed him to rescue 2 more families in quick succession, bringing his total to 43 people safely evacuated from the disaster zone. But 7 residents were still unaccounted for, and Jake could see on the horizon the towering wall of clouds that marked Hurricane Delilah's eye wall approaching from the west. When the backside of the hurricane arrived, it would bring winds even stronger than those he had already endured, along with a final surge of floodwater that would inundate anything still standing in Pelican Bay. Jake had less than 20 minutes to find and rescue the remaining 7 people before conditions became impossible even for the most experienced hurricane pilot. As he searched the flooded community for signs of the missing residents, Jake's fuel gauge showed that he was approaching the minimum reserves needed to reach safety. Every minute spent in the disaster area reduced his chances of successfully returning to Bayfield Municipal Airport, but abandoning the search would mean leaving people to die in the final assault of the hurricane. The decision was made for him when his radio crackled with a weak transmission from a handheld radio. 7 people had taken shelter in the upper floor of the community's small church, a building that appeared to be structurally sound but was completely surrounded by floodwater that was still rising. Jake found the church just as the first winds from Hurricane Delilah's backside began to arrive. The building's steeple was swaying visibly in the strengthening wind, and Jake could see people waving from the windows of the church's upper floor. Getting 7 people into his helicopter in a single trip would exceed every weight and balance limit he had ever operated under, but making multiple trips was impossible with the eye wall approaching. Jake brought the Huey into a hover next to the church's second-floor window and began what would be the most challenging passenger loading operation of his career. The 7 residents climbed into the helicopter's cabin and cargo area, filling every available space with desperate people who understood that this was their last chance for survival. Jake's aircraft was now loaded far beyond its normal capacity, carrying the human cargo that would challenge every aspect of the old helicopter's performance. As he lifted off from the church, Jake could feel the Huey struggling under the excessive weight. The helicopter's climb rate was reduced to barely 50 feet per minute, and the engine temperature gauge showed readings that were approaching the red line. But the old aircraft continued to fly, its proven design accommodating loads that would have exceeded the capabilities of more modern machines. The flight back to the school evacuation center took place as Hurricane Delilah's eye wall engulfed Pelican Bay with renewed fury. Wind gusts exceeding 170 miles per hour hammered the overloaded helicopter, while debris filled the air like horizontal hail. Jake flew by instinct more than instruments, feeling his way through the storm while his passengers prayed in multiple languages. When he finally reached the school and deposited his last 7 passengers on the roof, Jake had completed one of the most remarkable rescue operations in aviation history. 50 people owed their lives to his willingness to fly an aging helicopter through the heart of a major hurricane. But as he shut down the Huey's engine on the school roof, Jake realized that his rescue mission had cost him more than just fuel and mechanical stress. His aircraft was stranded in Pelican Bay with no way to return to Bayfield Municipal Airport until Hurricane Delilah passed completely through the area. The old helicopter that had been mocked for its age and appearance had just proven that sometimes the most reliable equipment is the gear that looks least impressive. Jake's surplus military Huey had performed flawlessly under conditions that would have grounded every other civilian aircraft in Louisiana. As Hurricane Delilah's eye wall passed over the school, Jake took shelter inside the building with the 50 people he had rescued. Outside, the storm continued its assault on what remained of Pelican Bay. But inside the concrete structure, 50 families were safe because one pilot had refused to let appearance dictate performance. The story of Jake Morrison and his mocked helicopter was just beginning to spread through the aviation community, but the man himself was too exhausted to care about recognition or praise. He had done what any competent pilot would do when faced with people in distress. He had used every bit of skill and equipment at his disposal to save as many lives as possible. The old Huey sat quietly on the school roof, its battle-scarred exterior showing new damage from the hurricane rescue mission. But inside its mechanical heart, every component had performed exactly as designed, proving once again that reliability and capability matter more than appearance when lives are on the line. Tomorrow would bring media attention, government investigations, and aviation awards that Jake had never sought. But tonight, in the aftermath of Hurricane Delilah, 50 people were alive because one pilot had refused to accept that his old helicopter was just a flying museum piece. The storm would pass, the flood waters would recede, and Pelican Bay would eventually rebuild. But the legend of the mocked helicopter that saved 50 lives would endure long after the last traces of Hurricane Delilah had been cleared away. The first light of dawn revealed a landscape transformed beyond recognition. Where Pelican Bay had stood 24 hours earlier, only scattered rooftops and broken pilings emerged from a brown sea of flood water that stretched to the horizon. Hurricane Delilah had moved inland during the night, leaving behind devastation that would take years to fully comprehend. Jake Morrison stood on the school roof beside his battered Huey, surveying the destruction through bloodshot eyes that had seen too much in the past 18 hours. The helicopter's olive drab paint was streaked with salt residue and debris scars, while several rotor blade tips showed fresh gouges from flying through the storm's fury. But the old aircraft had survived the night intact, a testament to engineering that prioritized function over form. Inside the school building, 50 survivors were beginning to process the magnitude of what they had experienced. Families huddled together in classrooms that had been converted into emergency shelters, sharing blankets and hot coffee provided by Red Cross volunteers who had arrived at first light. The conversations were hushed, marked by the peculiar quiet that follows catastrophic events when people struggle to reconcile survival with loss. Maria Santos held her 3 children close as she watched the sunrise through a classroom window. Less than 12 hours earlier, she had passed each child across a gap of churning flood water to a helicopter pilot who had risked everything to save strangers. The memory felt surreal in the morning light, like something from a vivid dream rather than lived experience. Her youngest son, Carlos, who had frozen with terror during the rescue, was drawing pictures with crayons provided by relief workers. His artwork showed helicopters with enormous rotor blades carrying stick figures to safety, each drawing more elaborate than the last. For a 5-year-old who had nearly died in a collapsing house, art was becoming his way of processing trauma. That had no adequate words. "Mommy, is the helicopter man coming back?" Carlos asked, not looking up from his drawing of a green aircraft surrounded by storm clouds. Maria didn't know how to answer. She had seen Jake Morrison briefly during the night when he brought in the last group of survivors, but he had disappeared into the crowd of rescued families before she could thank him properly. The man who had saved her family's lives remained a mystery, someone whose name she had heard over radio transmissions, but whose face she had barely glimpsed in the chaos of the rescue. 3 classrooms away, Captain Rodriguez was telling his story to a growing audience of survivors and relief workers. The fishing boat captain had been Jake's first rescue, pulled from the sinking Miss Catherine just moments before the vessel was destroyed against the breakwater rocks. His hands still shook when he described watching his boat disappear beneath the storm surge while hurricane winds tried to tear him loose from the helicopter's landing skids. "I've been fishing these waters for 30 years, Rodriguez said, his voice hoarse from shouting over rotor noise and hurricane winds. "I've seen boats sink and men die, but I never saw anything like what that pilot did yesterday. He flew into conditions that should have killed him just to save 3 men he'd never met." Rodriguez's story was being repeated throughout the shelter. As survivors compared their rescue experiences, each account revealed another facet of Jake Morrison's impossible mission, painting a picture of piloting skill that bordered on the supernatural. The elderly couple who had been hoisted from their floating trailer described watching their home disappear beneath floodwater moments after the helicopter departed. The nursing home residents spoke of a pilot who had made multiple trips through deteriorating conditions to evacuate every patient before the building's 2nd floor was compromised. But Jake himself remained largely absent from these conversations. He had spent the night performing maintenance on his helicopter, checking for storm damage and preparing for whatever missions the new day might bring. Aviation was his profession and his passion, but the extraordinary nature of his rescue operation was still sinking in as emergency responders began arriving from across Louisiana. The first helicopter to reach Pelican Bay after the storm carried Major General Patricia Hayes, commander of the Louisiana National Guard's disaster response operations. Hayes had coordinated hurricane relief efforts for over a decade, but the initial aerial reconnaissance of Pelican Bay left her struggling to comprehend the scope of destruction that Hurricane Delilah had inflicted on the small coastal community. "Jesus Christ," she muttered, studying the scene through binoculars as her pilot circled the flood zone. "How many casualties are we looking at here?" Her aide, Colonel Michael Chun, consulted preliminary damage assessments that had been compiled during the night. Initial reports suggested 50 to 60 people were unaccounted for when the storm surge peaked. "We were expecting significant loss of life based on the failure of the evacuation order." Hayes continued scanning the devastated landscape, looking for signs of survivors who might still need rescue. What she saw instead were empty rooftops and floating debris where homes had stood just hours earlier. The destruction was so complete that she began preparing mental frameworks for a mass casualty event that would require federal disaster declaration and extended National Guard deployment. "General, you need to see this," her pilot said, pointing toward the school building where a lone helicopter sat on the roof. "That aircraft wasn't here yesterday when we reviewed pre-storm positioning. Someone flew in after the hurricane hit." Hayes adjusted her binoculars to study the weathered Huey more carefully. The helicopter's military origins were obvious despite its civilian registration markings, but its presence on the school roof raised immediate questions. No responsible pilot would have attempted flight operations during a major hurricane, and certainly no military aircraft had been authorized for storm rescue missions. "Take us down to that school," Hayes ordered. "I want to know who was crazy enough to fly in Hurricane Delilah." As the National Guard helicopter settled onto the school's athletic field, Hayes could see survivors beginning to emerge from the building. The number of people visible was far higher than the handful of casualties she had expected to find, and their general condition suggested successful evacuation rather than disaster survival. Jake Morrison walked out to meet the National Guard commander, moving with the deliberate pace of someone whose body was operating on willpower rather than energy. His flight suit was stained with hydraulic fluid and salt residue, while his face showed the deep fatigue that comes from 18 hours of high-stress aviation operations. "General Hayes, I'm Jake Morrison, Morrison Helicopter Services. One conducted evacuation operations here yesterday during the storm passage." Hayes studied Jake with the experienced eye of someone who had evaluated thousands of military personnel under stress. His bearing suggested military training, but his equipment and operational authority were clearly civilian. The combination raised questions that would require detailed answers. "Mr. Morrison, are you telling me that you flew rescue missions during Hurricane Delilah?" A Category 4 hurricane with sustained winds exceeding 150 miles per hour? "Yes, ma'am. I evacuated 50 people from flood zones between approximately 1400 and 1900 hours yesterday. All passengers were delivered safely to this evacuation center." The magnitude of Jake's statement hit Hayes like a physical blow. 50 people represented virtually every missing resident that emergency management officials had feared were dead. One civilian pilot, operating a surplus military helicopter, had single-handedly prevented what should have been Louisiana's worst hurricane disaster in decades. 50 people? Hayes repeated, struggling to process the implications. "You evacuated 50 people during the height of a major hurricane?" "Yes, ma'am. Fishing boat crew, nursing home residents, families with small children, elderly couples, teenagers who ignored evacuation orders, anyone who needed rescue and was still alive when I found them." Colonel Chun had been listening to the conversation with growing amazement. His expertise in disaster response operations made him acutely aware of the impossibility of what Jake was describing. Hurricane rescue missions were typically conducted by specialized military crews, using aircraft specifically designed for extreme weather operations. The idea that a civilian pilot had accomplished such a mission using an aging surplus helicopter challenged every assumption about emergency response capabilities. "Sir, what type of aircraft were you operating?" Chun asked, indicating the Huey on the school roof. 1987 Bell UH-1H, surplus from Fort Rucker. She's got about 8,000 hours on the airframe, but the engine was overhauled last year, and all major components are within service limits. Hayes found herself reevaluating everything she thought she knew about aviation capabilities and pilot skill. The Huey was a proven aircraft with an excellent service record, but it was also 40 years old and had never been designed for civilian hurricane operations. The pilot standing before her had accomplished something that military rescue specialists would have considered suicidal. "Mr. Morrison, I need you to understand the significance of what you've told me. My preliminary casualty estimates suggested we were looking at 50 to 60 fatalities from this storm. You're telling me that those casualties don't exist because you rescued them during the hurricane itself." Jake nodded, too exhausted to fully appreciate the broader implications of his actions. From his perspective, he had simply responded to emergency calls using the equipment and skills available to him. The fact that his response had been extraordinary was less important than the fact that it had been successful. "General, with respect, I didn't have time yesterday to worry about casualty estimates or operational parameters. There were people in immediate danger, and I had an aircraft capable of reaching them. Everything else was just details to work out during flight operations. Hayes realized she was witnessing something that would reshape disaster response protocols for years to come. Jake Morrison had demonstrated capabilities that exceeded the performance of specialized military rescue units, using equipment that most aviation experts would have considered inadequate for the mission. His success would require comprehensive analysis to understand how civilian operators might be integrated into future emergency response operations. But the immediate priority was ensuring that Jake's heroic actions received appropriate recognition and documentation. The story of 50 lives saved during Hurricane Delilah would inspire countless people and provide valuable lessons for improving disaster preparedness throughout the Gulf Coast region. Mr. Morrison, I want you to know that what you've accomplished here represents one of the most successful rescue operations in hurricane response history. We're going to make sure your actions are properly documented and recognized. Jake shifted, uncomfortably unused to praise from military officers. His focus remained on practical concerns rather than recognition or awards. General, I appreciate that, but right now I'm more concerned about getting my aircraft off this roof and back. T.O. Bayfield Municipal Airport. The Huey needs a thorough inspection after yesterday's operations, and I have a business to run. The practical concerns of civilian aviation seemed almost absurd in the context of Jake's heroic rescue mission. But Hayes understood that successful pilots maintained focus on operational details regardless of external circumstances. Jake's matter-of-fact approach to extraordinary achievement was itself a mark of genuine professionalism. We'll arrange transportation for your helicopter as soon as floodwaters recede enough to allow ground access to the school. In the meantime, I'd like you to brief my staff on your operational procedures yesterday. Your techniques could save lives in future disasters. As Hayes and her staff began documenting Jake's rescue operations, word of the helicopter pilot's extraordinary mission began spreading through emergency response networks across Louisiana. Radio transmissions and text messages carried fragments of the story to police departments, fire stations, and military installations throughout the region. At the Louisiana State Police Aviation Unit headquarters in Baton Rouge, Captain Sarah Williams was coordinating post-storm reconnaissance flights when she received a call from her counterpart at the National Guard. The information seemed too extraordinary to believe, but multiple independent sources were confirming the same impossible story. You're telling me that one civilian pilot rescued 50 people during Hurricane Delilah? Williams asked, reviewing flight operations reports that showed no authorized aircraft in the Pelican Bay area during the storm. That's what General Hayes is reporting from the scene. Apparently this guy flew a surplus Huey through the entire hurricane, making multiple rescue trips while the eye wall was passing over the coast. Williams had been flying search and rescue missions for 12 years, including operations during Hurricanes Katrina, Rita, and Gustav. Her experience made her acutely aware of the extreme skill and courage required to conduct rescue operations in severe weather conditions. What Jake Morrison had reportedly accomplished exceeded anything she had ever seen or heard of in civilian aviation. Do we have any background information on this pilot? Military experience, flight hours, previous emergency operations? Still gathering details, but initial information suggests he's a Vietnam-era veteran who's been operating helicopter services in the Gulf Coast region for about 20 years. Apparently his aircraft has been something of a local joke among other pilots because of its age and appearance. The irony was not lost on Williams. Throughout her career, she had observed that the most capable pilots often flew the least impressive aircraft, while show-offs gravitated toward expensive equipment that compensated for limited skill. Jake Morrison's success with an aging Huey was consistent with that pattern, suggesting genuine competence rather than equipment dependence. As emergency responders continued arriving in Pelican Bay throughout the morning, Jake found himself reluctantly becoming the center of attention for operations that he considered routine applications of basic helicopter skills. Medical personnel wanted to examine him for injuries or exhaustion. Aviation safety inspectors needed detailed accounts of his flight operations. News reporters were requesting interviews about his rescue mission. But Jake's priority remained his helicopter and the mechanical issues that might have developed during 18 hours of extreme operations. He climbed back onto the school roof to perform a comprehensive post-flight inspection, checking fluid levels, examining control linkages, and looking for any signs of stress or damage that could affect future flight safety. The Huey's engine compartment told the story of the previous day's demanding operations. Oil temperatures had run higher than normal. Transmission fluid showed signs of thermal stress, and several hydraulic lines showed minor weeping that would require attention before the aircraft returned to service. But overall, the old helicopter had performed flawlessly under conditions that would have grounded more sophisticated machines. As Jake worked on his aircraft, survivors continued sharing their rescue stories with arriving emergency personnel. The accounts painted a picture of flying skill that seemed to defy the laws of physics and meteorology. Witnesses described seeing the Huey maintain precise hovering positions in hurricane-force winds, executing landings on unstable structures, and lifting loads that exceeded normal aircraft limitations. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, who had been among the nursing home residents rescued during the storm, provided one of the most detailed accounts of Jake's flying abilities. As a retired Air Force flight surgeon, she had extensive experience evaluating pilot performance under stress, and her professional perspective lent credibility to descriptions that might otherwise have seemed exaggerated. "I watched this man position his helicopter within inches of our building while fighting crosswinds that were trying to slam him into the structure," Martinez told General Hayes during her formal debrief. "The level of precision was unlike anything I've seen in 30 years around military aviation. He wasn't just flying that aircraft. He was making it dance in conditions that should have made controlled flight impossible." Martinez's technical knowledge allowed her to appreciate aspects of Jake's performance that other survivors had witnessed but couldn't fully understand. His ability to maintain consistent rotor clearances while hovering near obstacles demonstrated spatial awareness and control touch that were developed through years of demanding flight operations. His management of power and collective pitch during heavy lifting operations showed deep understanding of helicopter aerodynamics and performance limitations. "General, I need you to understand that what this pilot accomplished wasn't just heroic. It was a masterclass in advanced helicopter operations. Every major flight school in the country should be studying his techniques." As the morning progressed, Jake's rescue operation began attracting attention from far beyond Louisiana's emergency response community. Federal aviation officials received reports that a civilian pilot had conducted Category 4 hurricane rescue operations using an aircraft that wasn't certified for such missions. Military aviation commands were briefed on techniques that exceeded the capabilities demonstrated by specialized rescue units during previous disasters. At the Federal Aviation Administration's Southern Region headquarters in Atlanta, Senior Inspector Robert Chun was reviewing preliminary reports about Jake's operations with growing concern about regulatory compliance and safety oversight. Hurricane rescue missions were typically conducted by military or Coast Guard units operating under specific authorizations and safety protocols. A civilian pilot conducting such operations raised immediate questions about proper authority and risk management. This pilot operated in weather conditions that we would consider prohibitive for any civilian aircraft, Chun told his supervisor during an emergency teleconference. "I'm not questioning the humanitarian value of his actions, but we need to understand how this happened and whether proper procedures were followed." Chun's concerns reflected the institutional perspective of aviation safety officials, who balanced emergency response needs against regulatory requirements designed to prevent accidents and limit liability. Jake's successful mission complicated that balance by demonstrating that extraordinary circumstances might justify operations that exceeded normal safety parameters. But the broader aviation community was beginning to recognize Jake's achievement as something that transcended regulatory concerns. Helicopter pilots throughout the Gulf Coast region were analyzing reports of his operations, trying to understand how he had accomplished missions that they would have considered impossible. Captain Tommy Rodriguez, who operated helicopter services for offshore oil platforms, had known Jake for 15 years and had frequently joined other pilots in good-natured mockery of his aging. Huey, the reports coming from Pelican Bay forced Rodriguez to reevaluate everything he thought he knew about aircraft capability and pilot skill. "I've been flying helicopters for 22 years, and I wouldn't have attempted what Jake did yesterday," Rodriguez told colleagues at a pilot briefing in New Orleans. "That old Huey of his always looked like it belonged in a scrapyard. But apparently it's been hiding capabilities that none of us understood." The revelation was particularly humbling for pilots who flew newer, more sophisticated aircraft that Jake's Huey had dramatically outperformed under the most demanding conditions imaginable. Modern helicopters offered computerized flight controls, advanced navigation systems, and turbine engines that provided smooth, quiet operation. But when Hurricane Delilah had grounded every other aircraft in Louisiana, Jake's mechanical dinosaur had kept flying. As news of the rescue operation spread through aviation networks, retired military pilots who had flown Hueys during the Vietnam War began sharing their own stories about the helicopter's legendary reliability and durability. The aircraft had been designed for combat operations where mechanical failure often meant death, creating engineering priorities that emphasized function over comfort or appearance. Master Sergeant William Thompson, who had maintained UH-1H helicopters during 3 tours in Southeast Asia, wasn't surprised by reports of Jake's successful hurricane operations. Those old Hueys were built like tanks and designed to keep flying when everything else broke down. If you had to choose one helicopter to fly through a hurricane, the UH-1H would be at the top of the list. Thompson's perspective reflected decades of experience with aircraft that had been tested under the most extreme conditions military operations could produce. Vietnam-era helicopters had endured tropical storms, enemy fire, mechanical failures, and maintenance challenges that modern civilian aircraft never encountered. The engineering lessons learned during that conflict had produced machines that prioritized survival over sophistication. By late morning, Jake's rescue operation was being discussed in aviation circles throughout the United States. Flight instructors were analyzing his techniques for possible inclusion in emergency procedures. Training. Aircraft manufacturers were studying reports of the Huey's performance for insights into design priorities that enhanced operational capability. Military commands were reviewing their own hurricane response protocols to understand how a single civilian pilot had achieved results that exceeded specialized rescue unit capabilities. But the most significant impact of Jake's mission was beginning to emerge among the families he had rescued. Children who had survived terrifying experiences were beginning to process their trauma through play and art that featured heroic helicopter pilots. Parents who had faced certain death were struggling to find adequate words for gratitude that transcended normal human experience. Elderly residents who had been evacuated from the nursing home were sharing stories that would become family legends passed down through generations. Maria Santos found herself repeatedly telling her children about the pilot who had saved their lives, but each retelling seemed to diminish the extraordinary nature of what they had experienced. Words couldn't capture the terror of watching their house collapse while floodwater rose around them, or the miraculous appearance of a helicopter that shouldn't have been able to fly in such conditions. "How do you thank someone for giving you your life back?" she asked other survivors during an informal gathering in the school cafeteria. What do you say to a person who risked everything to save strangers? The question had no adequate answer, but it reflected the profound impact that Jake's actions had on people who understood that they owed their continued existence to one man's courage and skill. The helicopter pilot had become more than just their rescuer. He had become a symbol of hope and human decency that would influence their worldview for the rest of their lives. As the day progressed, Jake continued his mechanical inspection while trying to avoid the growing media tension surrounding his rescue operation. Reporters from New Orleans television stations had arrived in Pelican Bay, drawn by reports of an extraordinary hurricane rescue mission that was already being compared to the most heroic aviation operations in American history. But Jake remained focused on practical concerns rather than public recognition. His helicopter needed repairs before it could safely return to service. His business required attention after a day of unplanned operations, and he had commitments to other customers who were depending on his aviation services. The extraordinary nature of his hurricane rescue mission was less important to him than maintaining the professional standards that had sustained his career for 25 years. When NBC News correspondent Jennifer Walsh approached him for an interview, Jake politely but firmly declined to discuss his operations for broadcast. "Ma'am, I appreciate your interest, but I'm not comfortable being on television." "What happened?" "Yesterday was just part of doing my job when people needed help." Walsh persisted, recognizing that Jake's story represented exactly the kind of human interest content that would resonate with audiences across the country. Hurricane disasters typically produce tragic stories of loss and destruction, but Jake's rescue mission offered something rare in disaster coverage: an unqualified victory achieved through individual courage and competence. "Mr. Morrison, what you accomplished yesterday saved 50 lives during one of the most destructive hurricanes in Louisiana history. People need to hear about heroes who step up when everything else fails." Jake continued working on his helicopter. While considering Walsh's request, he understood that media attention could benefit his business by demonstrating his capabilities to potential customers, but he also valued the privacy and anonymity that had allowed him to build a successful career without public scrutiny. "Listen, if you want to tell a story about heroes, talk to the people who survived yesterday. They're the ones who showed real courage by trusting a stranger in a beat-up helicopter when they had every reason to be afraid. I just provided transportation." Walsh recognized that Jake's reluctance to accept praise actually enhanced the power of his story. Genuine heroes typically minimize their own actions while emphasizing the needs of people they had helped, creating narratives that felt authentic rather than self-promotional. Jake's matter-of-fact description of risking his life to save 50 people made his achievement seem even more extraordinary. As afternoon approached, the logistics of extracting Jake's helicopter from the school roof became the focus of recovery operations. The Huey was too large to be transported by truck, even if roads to Pelican Bay had been passable, and flying it out would require clearing debris from areas around the school that could interfere with rotor clearance during takeoff. National Guard engineering units began clearing the school's athletic field to create a safe departure zone for the helicopter. Heavy equipment operators worked to remove tree limbs, sections of destroyed buildings, and twisted metal debris that Hurricane Delilah had scattered across the landscape. The operation required several hours of careful work to ensure that Jake could safely lift off without encountering obstacles that could damage his rotor system. While the clearing operation progressed, Jake continued receiving visitors who wanted to thank him personally for his rescue efforts. Families approached him individually and in small groups, often struggling to find words that could adequately express their gratitude for actions that had literally saved their lives. Captain Rodriguez, the fishing boat captain who had been Jake's first rescue, returned to the school specifically to meet the pilot who had pulled him from the sinking Miss Catherine. The two men had communicated only by radio during the rescue, leaving Rodriguez with questions about the person who had risked everything to save three strangers. "Brother, I don't know how to thank you for what you did yesterday," Rodriguez said, extending his hand to Jake with the formality of someone acknowledging a profound debt. "You saved my life and the lives of my crew when nobody else could reach us." Jake accepted the handshake, but deflected the praise with the characteristic discomfort of someone unused to being the center of attention. "Captain, you would have done the same thing if you'd been flying and I'd been on that boat. It's what people do when others are in trouble." Rodriguez shook his head, understanding from 30 years of commercial fishing that Jake's actions had been far from routine. "No, sir, what you did was special. I've seen a lot of brave men in dangerous situations, but I've never seen anything like flying a helicopter through Hurricane Delilah to pull people off sinking boats and collapsing buildings." The conversation reflected the broader impact that Jake's rescue mission was having on people throughout Louisiana's maritime and aviation communities. Professional mariners and pilots understood the extreme skill and courage required for hurricane operations, making their appreciation for Jake's achievement particularly meaningful to him. As the debris clearing operation neared completion, Jake began preparing for departure from Pelican Bay. His helicopter had survived 18 hours of hurricane operations with minimal damage, but returning to Bayfield Municipal Airport would require careful navigation through airspace that was still cluttered with emergency aircraft and recovery operations. General Hayes approached Jake as he conducted his final pre-flight inspection, carrying documentation that would officially recognize his rescue operations for military and civilian aviation records. The paperwork would ensure that Jake's achievement was properly documented in emergency response databases and pilot qualification records. "Mr. Morrison, I want to present you with a letter of commendation for your exceptional service during Hurricane Delilah recovery operations. Your actions saved 50 lives and demonstrated the highest standards of aviation professionalism under extreme conditions." Jake accepted the letter but remained focused on his departure preparations rather than ceremony or recognition. "General, I appreciate the documentation, but right now I need to get this bird back to base and properly inspected before I take on any more customers." Hayes smiled, recognizing Jake's priorities as consistent with the practical focus that had enabled his successful rescue mission. Military officers understood that effective operators maintained attention to detail and professional standards, regardless of external recognition or pressure. "Mr. Morrison, before you depart, I want you to know that your techniques yesterday are going to be studied and integrated into our disaster response training programs. You've demonstrated capabilities that will save lives in future emergencies." As Jake lifted off from the school athletic field, 50 survivors watched from windows and doorways, many of them seeing for the last time the helicopter that had carried them to safety through the fury of Hurricane Delilah. The old Huey climbed slowly into the clear afternoon sky, its distinctive rotor sound fading as Jake headed toward home base and the routine operations that had sustained his career for 2 decades. But the impact of his extraordinary rescue mission was just beginning to spread through communities far beyond Pelican Bay, inspiring people who understood that sometimes the most important heroes are the ones who show up when nobody else can. Flying aircraft that look like they belong in museums, but perform like they were built for miracles. The story of Jake Morrison and his mocked helicopter had become legend in the making. Proof that appearances can deceive and that true capability often hides behind humble exteriors. 50 people owed their lives to that lesson, and their children would grow up knowing that heroes sometimes arrive in packages that nobody expects. Flying machines that others dismiss until the moment when everything depends on getting the job done. As the sun set over the Louisiana coast, recovery operations continued in Pelican Bay while Jake Morrison returned to the anonymous life of a small-town helicopter pilot. But the echoes of his hurricane rescue mission would resonate for years to come, reminding people that extraordinary times call forth extraordinary responses from ordinary people who refuse to accept that something cannot be done simply because others say it is impossible. 6 months after Hurricane Delilah swept through Louisiana, Jake Morrison was performing routine cargo operations when his radio crackled with an unexpected transmission. The call came from Washington, D.C., from an office that most civilian pilots never dealt with directly. Morrison Helicopter Services, this is Colonel Davis with the Department of Transportation. We need to speak with Jake Morrison regarding his hurricane rescue operations. Jake set down his coffee and reached for the radio microphone, wondering what federal officials could want with a small-town helicopter operator half a year after the storm. His rescue mission had generated paperwork and recognition that he'd tried to minimize, preferring to return to the anonymous work that had sustained his business for 20 years. This is Jake Morrison. How can I help you, Colonel? Mr. Morrison, we're putting together a new federal disaster response protocol, and your techniques during Hurricane Delilah are being considered for national implementation. We'd like you to travel to Washington for a consultation with emergency management officials. The invitation represented recognition that Jake had never sought and didn't particularly want. His hurricane rescue mission had been conducted using skills and equipment that any competent pilot could have employed under similar circumstances. The idea that his techniques deserved federal study seemed disproportionate to what he considered routine applications of basic helicopter capabilities. But the request also represented potential opportunities for his business and the broader aviation community. If his methods could improve disaster response operations nationwide, Jake felt obligated to share whatever knowledge might help save lives in future emergencies. Colonel, I'm honored by the invitation, but I'm not sure what I can tell you that wouldn't be obvious to any experienced helicopter pilot. What happened during Delilah was mostly about having the right equipment available when people needed help. Mr. Morrison, what you accomplished that day exceeded the capabilities demonstrated by specialized military rescue units during comparable disasters. We need to understand how civilian operators might be integrated into federal emergency response protocols. Jake agreed to the Washington consultation, though he remained skeptical about the value of his contribution to federal disaster planning. His success during Hurricane Delilah had resulted from specific circumstances that might not be replicable during other emergencies. The aging Huey's mechanical reliability, his own military training and experience, and the particular geographic and meteorological conditions of Pelican Bay had combined to create a unique situation that defied systematic analysis. 3 weeks later, Jake found himself in a Pentagon conference room surrounded by military officers, federal emergency officials, and aviation experts who treated him with a deference that made him deeply uncomfortable. The meeting participants included specialists from FEMA, the Coast Guard, the National Guard, and civilian aviation authorities who had spent months analyzing every aspect of his hurricane rescue operation. Colonel Sarah Martinez, who directed the Defense Department's Disaster Response Coordination Office, began the briefing with an overview of traditional hurricane evacuation procedures and their limitations during rapidly developing storms. Her presentation highlighted the gap between theoretical rescue capabilities and actual performance when weather conditions exceeded operational parameters for conventional aircraft. Mr. Morrison, current protocols require civilian evacuation to be completed before hurricane conditions reach tropical storm force. Your operations demonstrate that rescue missions can be conducted successfully even during the peak intensity of major hurricanes. Jake shifted uncomfortably in his chair, surrounded by officials whose expertise far exceeded his own understanding of emergency management systems. His rescue mission had been an improvised response to immediate circumstances rather than a carefully planned operation that could serve as a model for systematic implementation. "Colonel, I think you might be overestimating what happened during Delilah. I had one helicopter, local knowledge of the area, and weather conditions that happened to favor the Huey's particular capabilities. That's not necessarily applicable to other situations or aircraft." General Robert Chun, who commanded the National Guard's aviation units, had been studying detailed reports of Jake's operations for months. His analysis focused on the tactical decisions and flying techniques that had enabled successful rescues under conditions that would have grounded military aircraft. "Mr. Morrison, our technical evaluation indicates that your mission succeeded because you maintained operational flexibility while other aircraft were limited by regulatory constraints and equipment limitations. Your helicopter's mechanical simplicity and your willingness to accept calculated risks created capabilities that exceeded our specialized rescue units." The assessment highlighted institutional problems that military commanders had recognized, but struggled to address within existing bureaucratic structures. Specialized rescue aircraft were expensive to operate and maintain, limiting their availability during emergencies when multiple simultaneous missions might be required. Regulatory requirements designed to ensure safety often prevented operations that could save lives when conditions exceeded normal parameters. Jake's success with a surplus military helicopter suggested that civilian operators using older, simpler aircraft might provide emergency response capabilities that complemented rather than competed with military and Coast Guard resources. But integrating civilian aircraft into federal disaster operations would require regulatory changes and coordination mechanisms that didn't currently exist. "General, if you're thinking about using civilian helicopters for disaster response, you need to understand that most operators don't have aircraft suitable for extreme weather operations. The Huey worked because it was designed for combat conditions, but civilian helicopters are built for different mission requirements." Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who directed FEMA's Aviation Coordination Office, had been developing new protocols that would expand federal authority to mobilize civilian aircraft during declared emergencies. Her research had identified hundreds of surplus military helicopters in civilian hands that could potentially provide disaster response capabilities if properly integrated into federal command structures. "Mr. Morrison, we've identified approximately 300 surplus military helicopters currently operated by civilian companies throughout the United States. Many of these aircraft have capabilities similar to your Huey, but their operators lack the training and authorization to conduct emergency missions." Walsh's proposal involved creating a civilian auxiliary program similar to the Civil Air Patrol, but focused specifically on helicopter operations during natural disasters. Participating operators would receive specialized training in emergency procedures and would be subject to federal activation during declared disasters. Jake recognized the potential value of such a program, but he also understood the practical challenges of implementing systematic disaster response using civilian aircraft and pilots with varying levels of experience and capability. His own success had depended on specific knowledge and skills that couldn't be quickly transferred to other operators. Dr. Walsh, training civilian pilots for hurricane operations would require extensive preparation and ongoing proficiency requirements. Most helicopter operators work in industries that don't involve emergency flying, and they might not be comfortable with the risks involved in disaster response. The discussion continued for several hours as federal officials explored various approaches to expanding helicopter rescue capabilities during major disasters. Jake provided technical details about his operations while emphasizing the unique circumstances that had enabled his success. His input helped officials understand both the potential and limitations of integrating civilian aircraft into federal emergency response systems. As the meeting concluded, Jake was invited to participate in developing training protocols for civilian helicopter operators who might join the proposed auxiliary program. The work would involve creating standardized procedures for emergency operations, while maintaining the operational flexibility that had been crucial to his own success. But Jake's most significant contribution to disaster response improvement was already taking place far from Washington conference rooms. Throughout Louisiana and the broader Gulf Coast region, his hurricane rescue mission had inspired changes in how civilian pilots thought about their role during emergency situations. At flight training schools across the southeastern United States, instructors were incorporating lessons from Jake's operations into emergency procedures courses. Student pilots learned about the importance of mechanical reliability over sophisticated avionics when operating in extreme conditions. They studied examples of creative problem-solving and risk assessment that had enabled successful rescue operations under seemingly impossible circumstances. Captain Tommy Rodriguez, who operated helicopter services for offshore oil platforms, had implemented new maintenance protocols for his aircraft based on analysis of how Jake's Huey had performed during Hurricane Delilah. The emphasis shifted from routine scheduled maintenance to comprehensive inspection procedures that ensured aircraft readiness for emergency operations. What Jake proved is that having reliable equipment matters more than having the latest technology. When people's lives are on the line, Rodriguez explained to his maintenance crew during a training session, we need to make sure our aircraft can perform when everything else fails, not just when conditions are perfect. The broader aviation community was also beginning to recognize that Jake's achievement represented something more significant than an isolated rescue operation. His success challenged conventional wisdom about aircraft capability and pilot training that had developed around normal operational requirements rather than emergency response needs. At the annual Helicopter Association International Conference, Jake's hurricane rescue mission became the subject of multiple technical presentations and panel discussions. Aviation experts analyzed his flying techniques, maintenance practices, and decision-making processes for insights that could improve emergency response capabilities throughout the industry. But perhaps the most meaningful impact of Jake's mission was its effect on the 50 people whose lives he had saved and their families. 6 months after Hurricane Delilah, the survivors had rebuilt their homes and resumed their normal activities, but the experience of being rescued from certain death had permanently changed their perspective on community, courage, and human capability. Maria Santos had used insurance settlements and federal disaster assistance to rebuild her family's home on higher ground, incorporating design features that would provide better protection during future storms. But more importantly, she had become involved in local emergency preparedness efforts, helping other families develop evacuation plans and understand the importance of heeding weather warnings. Her son Carlos, who had been terrified during the helicopter rescue, had developed a fascination with aviation that led him to join a youth flying program at a nearby airport. His drawings of helicopters had evolved into serious study of aerodynamics and flight principles, suggesting a possible career path inspired by the pilot who had saved his life. He talks about Jake Morrison like he's a superhero, Maria told other parents during a school meeting about emergency preparedness. But I think that's exactly what he was to us that day, someone who showed up when nobody else could help. The nursing home residents who had been evacuated during the storm had collectively written a letter to Jake expressing their gratitude and describing how his rescue had given them additional years with their families. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, the retired Air Force flight surgeon, had used her professional connections to ensure that Jake's techniques were studied by military aviation medical specialists. What this man accomplished represents the highest standards of aviation medicine and rescue operations. Martinez wrote in a professional journal article about helicopter rescue techniques. His ability to maintain precision control under extreme stress conditions while managing multiple patient evacuations demonstrates capabilities that should be incorporated into military training programs. Captain Rodriguez, The fishing boat captain, who had been Jake's first rescue, had returned to commercial fishing, but with a new appreciation for weather forecasting and safety equipment. His experience of being pulled from a sinking vessel during a hurricane had made him a vocal advocate for improved marine safety regulations and emergency communication systems. "I've been fishing these waters for 30 years, but Jake Morrison taught me that there's always someone willing to risk their life to save strangers," Rodriguez told a maritime safety conference. "That kind of courage changes how you think about your responsibility to help other people when they're in trouble." The ripple effects of Jake's rescue mission continued expanding throughout the Louisiana coast as survivors shared their stories with friends, family members, and colleagues. Each retelling reinforced the message that individual courage and competence could overcome seemingly impossible challenges when applied with determination and skill. Local aviation businesses began experiencing increased interest from young people who had heard about Jake's hurricane rescue mission and wanted to learn helicopter flying. Flight schools reported growing enrollment in pilot training programs, with many students specifically citing Jake's example as their motivation for pursuing aviation careers. Jake himself remained largely unaware of his broader influence on the aviation community and emergency preparedness efforts. He had returned to routine helicopter operations, flying cargo missions, aerial surveys, and occasional medical transports that sustained his business and provided the independence he valued above recognition or awards. But his reputation within the helicopter community had fundamentally changed. Pilots who had once mocked his aging Huey now sought his advice about aircraft selection and maintenance practices. Aviation mechanics consulted him about reliability modifications that could improve helicopter performance during emergency operations. "Morrison's proved that the old ways still work when everything else fails," observed Chief Warrant Officer Michael Chun, who trained Army helicopter pilots at Fort Rucker. "His techniques are being incorporated into our combat rescue curriculum because they represent fundamental flying skills that technology can't replace." As the first anniversary of Hurricane Delilah approached, federal emergency management officials were implementing new protocols that incorporated lessons learned from Jake's rescue operations. The changes included provisions for mobilizing civilian aircraft during disasters, streamlined authorization procedures for emergency flight operations, and recognition programs for civilian pilots who demonstrated exceptional service during crises. Dr. Walsh's Civilian Helicopter Auxiliary Program had been approved and was beginning recruitment of qualified operators throughout hurricane-prone regions. The training curriculum emphasized the practical flying skills and risk assessment techniques that had enabled Jake's success, while acknowledging that not every pilot would be capable of or willing to attempt such demanding operations. Jake had agreed to serve as an instructor for the program, though he insisted that his role focus on technical training rather than publicity or recruitment activities. His contribution would emphasize aircraft selection, maintenance procedures, and flying techniques that maximize safety margins during emergency operations. The most important thing civilian pilots need to understand is that heroic flying is actually about being extremely careful and conservative, Jake explained during the first training session. "What looked dangerous about my hurricane mission was actually the result of very careful planning and preparation that minimized risks while achieving mission objectives." The training program attracted experienced helicopter pilots from throughout the southeastern United States, many of whom operated surplus military aircraft, similar to Jake's Huey. But the courses also revealed that Jake's success had depended on a unique combination of military training, civilian experience, and personal characteristics that couldn't be easily replicated through classroom instruction. "Morrison's got something that you can't teach in a flight school," observed retired Army pilot Colonel Patricia Hayes, who had become involved in the training program development. "He's got the judgment and courage to do what needs to be done when conventional procedures aren't adequate for the situation." As Jake continued his involvement in emergency preparedness efforts, he began to understand that his hurricane rescue mission had accomplished something beyond saving 50 lives. His example had demonstrated that individual citizens could make extraordinary contributions to community safety and disaster response when they possessed appropriate skills and equipment. The recognition brought opportunities that extended far beyond his modest helicopter service business. Aircraft manufacturers consulted him about design priorities for emergency response helicopters. Military commands invited him to participate in rescue training exercises. Emergency management agencies sought his input on disaster preparedness planning. But Jake's greatest satisfaction came from knowing that his techniques were being taught to other pilots who might face similar emergency situations in the future. If his experience during Hurricane Delilah could help save even one additional life during some future disaster, the attention and disruption to his private life would be worthwhile. The old Huey that had been mocked for its appearance continued, flying routine missions from Bayfield Municipal Airport, but its reputation had been permanently transformed. Aviation museums had requested the helicopter for display, recognizing its historical significance as the aircraft that had conducted one of the most successful civilian rescue operations in American history. Jake had declined the museum offers, preferring to keep his helicopter in active service where it could continue providing practical value to customers who needed reliable transportation. The aircraft had proven its capabilities during Hurricane Delilah, but its most important role remained the daily missions that sustained his business and served his community. As evening approached over the Louisiana coast, Jake Morrison completed another routine cargo flight and returned to his hangar at Bayfield Municipal Airport. The weathered building looked exactly the same as it had before Hurricane Delilah, but the helicopter inside had become legendary throughout the aviation community. Jake performed his standard post-flight inspection, checking fluid levels and examining control linkages with the same meticulous attention to detail that had enabled his hurricane rescue mission. The Huey's mechanical condition remained excellent, despite its age, testament to maintenance practices that prioritize reliability over appearance. Tomorrow would bring new missions and continuing opportunities to serve customers who valued dependable helicopter services over sophisticated equipment. Jake's extraordinary rescue operation had demonstrated that sometimes the most important capabilities were hidden behind humble exteriors, waiting for circumstances that demanded everything that skill, courage, and reliable machinery could provide. The story of the mocked helicopter that saved 50 lives had become more than just an inspiring tale of individual heroism. It represented proof that true capability often resided in unexpected places, ready to emerge when communities faced their greatest challenges and needed heroes who would show up regardless of the odds against success. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.